Good morning. Once again, my condolences to all of humanity, and particularly to the people of France for the loss of Notre Dame Cathedral. That is a hugely archetypal event, and it touched me very deeply. So I'm sure it touched many of you around the world very deeply. I spoke about it at length last night on our regular chat at 8 p.m. on Monday nights. And so you can find what I said about it last night there. And it's just really very sad. And you can see how the archetypal nature of that event, obviously fire is an archetype and it's a force of nature. And, I basically had what I had to say about it last night. Now, additionally, this session will be a conclusion of my reading and explanation of paragraphs 745 to 747 of this book, Answer to Job. And basically what Dr. Jung is saying to us in this particular passage is it's a message to humanity to grow up. We have to grow up. And what he means by that is that we must reach a new level of consciousness. And that is a monumental task. And he achieved it in his lifetime. But most of us have not yet achieved that level of consciousness. And so it's something that we need to be first aware of. And secondly, then we have to make the effort to achieve that level of consciousness. Now, yesterday I read these entire 3 paragraphs, and I'm not going to do that again. But I will read the first sentence. I will read the first sentence of paragraph 745, just to set the stage. And good morning, everyone. Welcome. Thank you. So this is just the first sentence of paragraph 745. And then I'm going to read paragraph 746 so that I set the stage for today. And then I'm going to go back through paragraph 746 and sentence by sentence explain it to you. And okay, I'm going to save your comments for later. So the first paragraph of the first sentence of paragraph 745 is this: everything now depends on man. Immense power of destruction is given into his hand, and the question is whether he can resist the will to use it and can temper his will with the spirit of love and wisdom. Okay, so now going over to paragraph 746, and let me give you the link to yesterday's session. If you are not aware of it, I will put it in the chat so that you can easily find that session, because that's part 1 of this 2-part series. I hope to finish the last 2 paragraphs today. So paragraph 746, the conscious realization of what is hidden and kept secret certainly confronts us with an insoluble conflict. At least this is how it appears to the conscious mind. But the symbols that rise up out of the unconscious in dreams show it rather as a confrontation of opposites, and the images of the goal represent their successful reconciliation. Something empirically demonstrable comes to our aid from the depths of our unconscious nature. It is the task of the conscious mind to understand these hints. If this does not happen, the process of individuation will nevertheless continue. The only difference is that we become its victims and are dragged along by fate towards that inescapable goal, which we might have reached walking upright if only we had taken the trouble and been patient enough to understand in time the meaning of the noumena that cross our path. The only thing that really matters now is whether man can climb up to a higher moral level, to a higher plane of consciousness, in order to be equal to the superhuman powers which the fallen angels have played into his hands. But he can make no progress with himself unless he becomes very much better acquainted with his own nature. Unfortunately, a terrifying ignorance prevails in this respect, and an equally great aversion to increasing the knowledge of his intrinsic character. However, in the most unexpected quarters nowadays, we find people who can no longer blink the fact that something ought to be done with man in regard to his psychology. Unfortunately, the little word ought tells us that they do not know what to do and do not know the way that leads to the goal. We can, of course, hope for the undeserved grace of God, who hears our prayers, but God, who also does not hear our prayers, wants to become man, and for that purpose he has chosen through the Holy Ghost the creaturely man filled with darkness, the natural man who is tainted with original sin, and who learnt the divine arts and sciences from the fallen angels. The guilty man is eminently suitable and is therefore chosen to become the vessel for the continuing incarnation, not the guiltless one who holds himself aloof from the world and refuses to pay his tribute to life, for in him the dark God would find no room. Okay, so that is the paragraph. And now I'll go back and I'll look at your comments briefly. Centerbush says, I just saw a YouTube video in where an American male real estate agent in New York tweeted about BTS. They look like kids, he says. How old are they? Are Asian women even attracted to their own men? He was fired. By, okay, there's a disconnect. He was fired by his company, and they apologized for the racist remarks. Is this the men reacting to them like you said? Well, certainly it's the beginning of it. Miles says, I will be happy except for a time needed for an errand. Powerful information today, yes. Good morning to everyone. I'm not going to respond to greetings because it just it's too distracting. But I will, I appreciate your presence, and I look forward to commenting on substantive chat comments. And I would very much appreciate it if you will tweet out that we're online this morning so that we can help others to understand these things. Miles says, saving Mother Earth depends on each person individuating for the supreme ethic of love. Yeah, I think that's true. Okay, so I'm now going to go back through this paragraph, and it's a fairly complicated paragraph. It's very difficult to understand on a first reading, and it's very difficult to understand if you're not well versed in Jungian psychology. So I'm going to do my best to tease it out for you so that you can understand where we're going. Okay, so this is in paragraph 746 of Answer to Job, which is found in volume 11 of the collected works of C.G. Jung. And I'm reading from paragraph 746 of this text, and 746 also volume 11. The conscious realization of what is hidden and kept secret certainly confronts us with an insoluble conflict. At least this is how it appears to the conscious mind. Okay, so the conflict is that we don't know what to do. We don't know how to raise ourselves to this new level of consciousness. And then he says, but the symbols that rise out of the unconscious in dreams show it rather as a confrontation of opposites, and the images of the goal represent their successful reconciliation. Now, this is a very significant pair of sentences, because what Jung is referring to is that all psychic energy comes from opposites, from spectra, or a scale between two opposites. And one side pulling against the other side creates psychic energy. So the more it gets built up on one side, boom, it'll snap back to the other side. And that's called enantiodromia, the tendency of things to turn into their opposites. Now, of course, our psyches are extremely complex, and we have literally thousands of opposites playing back and forth in our psyche. And they're going zing, 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 zing all the time. And you don't know where you are on any of those scales at any one moment. But that's where psychic energy comes from. And so when we talk about raising ourselves to a new level of consciousness, it's really hard to know what to do and how we can bring ourselves up to this new level, how we can bring our unconscious up to the conscious level. And so what I'm trying to do is help that to happen. And I want to go back now and read a couple of other passages from other books to help you understand. Now, the first passage is a paragraph from Man and His Symbols by C.G. Jung. And this was the book that Dr. Jung had written for laymen. And so, and I'm reading from the hardbound copy, which I hardly recommend you get for yourself. If you may have heard me read this before, but it's, for my lights, one of the most important things that Dr. Jung ever said, and that this was an essay that he finished only 10 days before the end of his life. So he obviously felt it was very important. He says, as any change must begin somewhere, it is the single individual who will experience it and carry it through. The change must indeed begin with an individual. It might be any one of us. Nobody can afford to look around and to wait for somebody else to do what he is loath to do himself. But since nobody seems to know what to do, it might be worthwhile for each of us to ask himself whether by any chance his or her unconscious may know something that will help us. Certainly the conscious mind seems unable to do anything useful in this respect. Man today is painfully aware of the fact that neither his great religions nor his various philosophies seem to provide him with those powerful animating ideas that would give him the security he needs in the face of the present condition of the world. Okay, so I read that because it finally told me that I know what I need to do, okay? And what I need to do, and what I've been doing for the last 10 years, is creating material online about Carl Jung's oeuvre for laymen. I'm aiming it specifically at laymen intentionally. And my purpose is that we have to educate people better about psychology. And so I've been myself, my deep unconscious, has been telling me for years that this needed to be done. And I started to do it with the website archetypeinaction.com in 2010. And by promoting it through Twitter in 2010, which explains why I have so many Twitter followers. And then I wasn't very satisfied about the response I was getting. I got many hits on archetypeinaction.com, but I did not get much interaction with the people I'm communicating with. And so in about 2016, when I decided to create the Carl Jung Depth Psychology Reading Group through Meetup, I also decided to use my YouTube channel as a way to also communicate that. And so you will find everything that we ever talked about, with the exception of 4 sessions, which were private, but except for those 4 sessions, and we've now had 123 sessions, you will find all of them on this YouTube channel. And I've been trying to build up knowledge about Dr. Jung's work through all that time. And I really didn't know why I was doing it, because I was building an audience somewhat, but I really wasn't getting through to the greater population. I was mainly getting through to people who have a special interest in Dr. Jung's work up till then, and then a very small group. So information was getting out very slowly. And then when this new, or not new, but this Korean band and singing group, BTS, decided to do their new album on Murray Stein's book, Jung's Map of the Soul, an introduction. And I realized that they have 80 million followers around the world. 80 million followers around the world, fans. I realized that there was here a tremendous opportunity to make people more aware of Dr. Jung's work and what it specifically means. And that's proven to be true. As soon as I saw that and realized that my desire to get psychology into the schools was going to be maybe a century-long project, because we would have all kinds of people disputing that in the United States. Religious figures of all kinds would try to hold it back. And so it's been very difficult to get anybody to even listen. And the psychologists that control the universities today are primarily Freudian, and they're talking about psychology at a very superficial level. And so they talk about behaviorism and so on, but they haven't gotten down to the depth and understood the depth. And that's what Dr. Jung did. And so, but those psychologists are threatened by Dr. Jung, and so are theologians. And so they have repressed his work for a century. And so now, with BTS adopting his work for their new album, Map of the Soul Persona, suddenly we get a new generation that's not jaded, that is willing to pay attention and to pass the word along to their fellows of that generation. And so the education is getting done at the iPhone level, at the social networking level. And fortunately, because I have done all that work before, and myself was forcing me to do it. As Dr. Jung explained, his self forced him to do what he did. Myself has forced me to do what I've done. And so now I have online a college level course and multiple college level courses about Dr. Jung's psychology. And so anybody in the world who has access to a computer or a smartphone can now get educated and without being stopped by all these interests that control our public education. And so as soon as I realized what that phenomenon would be, that's why I started this daily communication at 10 a.m., because this is a new audience. And so I'm considering this program, which I am going to do daily for the foreseeable future. I'm not sure I can do it 7 days a week, but I'm going to give it a try, and I may have to take some days off. It's very stressful on my throat, but in this 10 o'clock hour, I will be trying to explain some very basic principles in Dr. Jung's work, with special emphasis on focusing on the needs of the BTS armies. And I hope you'll join me. I'm now considering the Monday evening session to be an intermediate level, and I'm continuing to work with psychology and alchemy in that session. And in that session, we will be getting to, in a few weeks, we'll get to Dr. Jung's analysis of the dreams of Nobel Prize winning physicist Wolfgang Pauli. And Dr. Pauli was under Jungian analysis for quite a long time. He and Dr. Jung became close friends over many years, and his dreams are pure, and they show a pure progression of individuation in its details. And so the book called Psychology and Alchemy, which is volume 12 of the collected works of C.G. Jung, contains a part of the series of dreams that Dr. Pauli submitted to Dr. Jung and to Dr. Jung's colleague. And Dr. Pauli submitted about 1,000 dreams for this exercise, and I think there's 51 of them included in that book, so that you'll find that very interesting if you're interested in following up with that. But going back to our passage now, we're talking about the opposites, which is a fundamental idea, and then the idea that that they appear in dreams, and that the images of the goal represent their successful reconciliation. Okay, so we have all these opposites, and when one side of any opposite gets into power, it can cause depression, it can cause various kinds of neurosis. And Dr. Jung recognized that. And so he recognized that in opposites, there's a thesis and an antithesis. And so we can see this in society very clearly in American politics. So we have the red states and the blue states, and they're at odds. They're banging heads. And so one could say that the whole nation of the United States is in a collective neurosis. And we don't know how we can get out of that collective neurosis. And it's very frustrating, just as a big picture type of thing. And this has always been my interest anyway. I've been interested in the public policy issues that are affected by Dr. Jung's work. And what happens in the unconscious, okay, the unconscious is nature. and it's smarter than we are. Okay, it's smarter than our ego selves are. And what happens is when you have a neurosis like that, a thesis and an antithesis, the answer is there has to be a synthesis. In other words, we have to be able to integrate both sides of it, because the red state people are Americans too. The blue state people are Americans too. And if we want to be loyal and patriotic Americans, we have to respect our counterparts on the opposite side of the political spectrum. And the question is, how is that possible when we're screaming in one another's ears? And mind you, I don't know what the solution is yet, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But anyway, it's thesis and antithesis. And from that neurosis, someone or we will present a dream that will come up from the unconscious. And that's a synthesis. That's the third thing. And that will happen. That will emerge from the collective unconscious on, I believe it's November the 7th, 2020, because until then, we're going to have cable news networks that are pushing their sides of the red state, blue state dichotomy. But on election day, 2020, what's going to happen is there will be a synthesis, and we will have a new formation of the American government. And the winner will be symbolic of what's happening in the collective unconscious of the United States. So on that day, on that moment, when the winner is announced, that winner will be a symbol of the solution as of that day. Okay, so then what happens? Then we know what America unconsciously wants, and then the issue is that becomes a unity, which then immediately gets split apart again by a discernment. And so this comes from an alchemical idea that comes from the 3rd century, and it was from a woman alchemist named Maria Prophetessa. And Maria Prophetessa stated the axiom of Maria, which is 1 becomes 2, 2 becomes 3, 3 becomes 4, which is the 1. And so in terms of what I'm saying here now, as soon as you have any unity, whatever it is, in human ideas, okay? For example, we had the unity of Notre Dame, and all of us thought that that was solid and that that was going to be in our world forever. And then 1 becomes 2. Now that solid thing has become a destroyed thing. And yet the solid thing over here is within all of our hearts, or in most people's hearts. And whether you're for or against Christianity or Catholicism or whatever it is, Notre Dame represents a pinnacle in the development of the human species. Nobody can deny that. And so that pinnacle, which we all thought was solid and would never go away, suddenly is now in rubble. And so 1 becomes 2, and now what happens? There will be a synthesis between the solid thing we thought we had and the destruction, and there will be a reemergence of a new Notre Dame. It won't be the same. It will be a synthesis of the two. And, you know, in fairness, Notre Dame has been destroyed in various ways. sometimes over the last 800 years. So it's not unusual that this should necessarily happen, but it does happen. And when it does, there's an opportunity, and this is true of all dichotomies, of all opposites, there's an opportunity for regeneration. And so now there will be a synthesis of the old idea of what Notre Dame was, the new fact that that was destroyed, and now something new will emerge. It won't be the old Notre Dame. That's gone forever. And sadly, most of us that are alive today, the day after it burned, will never see the final version because it takes normally 1 century to build a cathedral. And so it's at least a 3-generation project. And many of the artistic skills that built Notre Dame are no longer available. And also, unlike the 12th century, we would no longer build only with wood. And obviously, that was one of the flaws in the structure of Notre Dame, because after 800 years, you can be sure that the wood that was in Notre Dame was quite dry. And once it was tindered, it goes up in smoke. And so, so we won't build it again only with wood. That's clear, and that wouldn't meet building standards today. And so it will be a different place, but it will be rebuilt, and it will again be quite beautiful, and it will cause the regeneration of artistic skills that may have been dead for 500 years. It's hard to know what was there that had been built into it that we don't even appreciate what has been lost. And so those skills are going to have to be regenerated in order to build the cathedral. And, you know, it's quite evident from President Macron on down last night that rebuilding would take place. And we all will look to our deep unconscious to know how that will be done. And you know, last night I showed this photograph of the people of Paris who were at the burning cathedral, and you can see that all of these people are deep in their unconscious, trying to understand what the loss of this building means to them. And I think that's a very profound thing. And so in alchemy, in any case, this axiom of Maria applies, which is 1 becomes 2, 2 becomes 3, a third thing, and then that third thing becomes 1 again on one day. All right, so in a family, a man and a woman become 2, become a pair, and they marry. They then have a child. They become 3, the third thing, the synthesis. So the child is a synthesis of the DNA of the 2 parents. And so 1 becomes 2, whether it doesn't matter whether male or female is on which are my 2 fifths, but that becomes a synthesis, which is a baby, which becomes the 4th thing, which is a family. So now you have a family, but that family now is the 1, and then perhaps another child will be built, and that child will be basically an outsider to that original family. So that will be another split, a discernment that splits into something else. So 1, the family becomes 2, a second child, which is then synthesized so that the second child is synthesized into the family, and the family becomes 1 again. And that process continues. And so when Dr. Jung is saying that the images of the goal represent their successful reconciliation, what the unconscious does is it presents through dreams and visions um, a symbol of the goal. And um, and so we might all want to examine our dreams and visions over the next few weeks, because we may see symbols of the new Notre Dame, as an example, or the new world that is going to emerge from this catastrophe that hit us last night. And so um, all right, so let me go on with the next sentence. Something empirically demonstrable comes to our aid from the depths of our unconscious nature. And so this is what I mean. A dream or a vision can come to our aid, and it is presented by the unconscious. And I happen to be listening to some videos of Jordan Peterson this morning, and Jordan Peterson made the comment that our unconscious, when it presents these symbols, never lies. Okay, it never lies. It tells you where you are at any given moment. So your unconscious never lies. And let me just reemphasize that I almost never hear anything that Dr. Peterson says that I don't agree with. I mostly agree with what he says, and he's a clinical psychologist, and he has a higher IQ than me, and so I can't challenge him about anything in clinical psychology, but I can agree with him about certain ideas that he presents, and in fact, most of the ideas that he presents. And so, in that context, I have great respect for him, and I especially have great respect for him for his biblical series. Okay, so then going on, the next sentence: if this does not happen, the process of individuation will nevertheless continue. Okay, so what Dr. Jung is now referring to is what I was talking about yesterday, which is that an oak tree knows how to become an oak tree. Okay, every oak tree is different, but the oak tree emerges from an unconscious force that's within the acorn. Okay, when the acorn is planted and it starts an oak tree, that acorn knows how to become an oak tree. And so the fertilized egg in the human woman knows how to become a human being. And not only does it know how to become a human being, it knows how to become you. And so it is constantly in that process. The unconscious is constantly in the process of manifesting you through your whole life, from the time that your mother's egg was fertilized by your father's sperm. From that moment on, that two-cell creature knew how to become you. And that process continues from the unconscious. So you don't have to think about most things in your life. You don't have to think about each of your hairs growing, for example. But there are some things that your unconscious has to keep informing you about. And what it informs you about is things that are most important to you at a depth level, especially. And so if you're going off the rails in terms of your process of becoming a human being, then you can bet that your unconscious is beating on your head, sending you very vivid dreams or nightmares, and maybe even conscious visions, because that's telling you something that you need to know. And as Dr. Peterson said in the video this morning, the unconscious never lies. Okay, it tells you what you need to know. Now, whether you act on that properly is another question, because your ego has to be able to understand that. So he's saying it is the task of the conscious mind to understand these hints. Okay, so these hints are coming up from your unconscious all the time, telling you what the best way forward is for you. Okay, it's not the best way forward for somebody in another country who's 5,000 miles away from you. It's what is best for you right now, based on you being a human being, born in the place you were born in, of the gender that you were born, et cetera, of the race that you were born. And your self, your God image, your deepest archetype in the unconscious is telling you how to become your best self all the time. And it's up to the ego to understand these hints and try to perform according to these hints. Then he goes on to say, if this does not happen, the process of individuation will nevertheless continue. In other words, if you don't understand the hints and you ignore them, the process of individuation, of you becoming the human being that you were always going to become anyway, that's going to happen. Okay. The only difference is, then he says, the only difference is that we become its victims and are dragged along by fate toward that inescapable goal, which we might have reached walking upright, if only we had taken the trouble and been patient enough to understand in time the meaning of the noumena that cross our path. Now, that's a big slug in that sentence. First of all, there's a famous Jungian quote about, the object is to make the unconscious conscious, and if you don't do that, you will call it fate. Okay, so all of us are lottery winners, let's say. First of all, we're the selected one of millions of sperm that came from your father. And so you're one in millions just from that. And then if you think back, we are all the children of creatures that successfully reproduced from the time of single-celled organisms. So for the last 3.5 billion years, life has been developing, and your ancestors, your grandfathers and grandmothers, going all the way back to that time, to that single-celled living organism, have all successfully reproduced. And metaphorically, women represent the tree of life, because only women can reproduce life. Men cannot do that. And so when the Bible refers to the tree of life being in the Garden of Eden, that tree of life is all women. Okay, it's not men, because men can't reproduce life. Only women can. And so we are all descended from female organisms all the way back to the time that sex was invented by protozoa, I guess, all the way to today. And every one of those women has reproduced successfully. This is why Dr. Edinger says nature is imperious, and it's Mother Nature. Mother Nature is imperious. She wants reproduction, and we are all the results of that successful reproduction, going all the way back to the first living thing. And that first living thing was our grandfather and grandmother too. But too many millions of greats back to be meaningful to anyone. And so when we're born, okay, that is a kind of fate. Okay, that's luck. That's favorable random accident positively exploited. But then you're going to become what you become, whatever that is, based on where you were placed on the planet and in the human species. And that's going to happen whether you're conscious enough of it or not. But individuation is about becoming conscious of it so that you know what is going to be best for you in any given situation. And that question is always being addressed by our unconscious. And our unconscious is giving us constantly these messages in dreams and visions, which is trying to adjust your attitude toward life so that you can become the best being that you can become. And this is a process that's going on 7 by 24 by 365. When we're conscious and our ego is at work, we basically, it's like, if there's this very dim light over in the corner and suddenly you turn on all the fluorescent lights in the house, then you're not going to see the little dim light that you have in your unconscious. But if you let that little light communicate with you, that's nature, that's instinct telling you what is best for you at this one moment. That's what it's doing. And so if you can understand its hints, then you can individuate consciously. And maybe it'll tell you that you're doing something wrong. And you may be upset by that. And so you may say, the heck with that. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do what I've been doing. And you keep doing it. And the result is that the psychic energy will build up in your unconscious, and you'll start to get more and more nightmares and more visions until you change your path. And then your unconscious will instinctually recalibrate and comment on the next thing. And so when you're not getting that communication, when you're not having dreams or visions, and I'm talking about normal human beings now, it probably means you're on a pretty good path toward becoming what you should ultimately be in life. But if suddenly you're getting very vivid dreams and very vivid nightmares, or suddenly visions come and you can actually see them in your waking life, then you know that you're off track and something has to be done. And so that's what it means. And, if we don't recognize these hits and act upon them, then fate is going to hit us. Okay. Then, whatever hits us, and our unconscious probably knew and could predict what was going to happen, but we ignored it. And so then fate whacks us in the side of the head and does something. And so that's what he's talking about there. And that's what he means by we make the unconscious conscious, or we'll call it fate. And that means we've abrogated our responsibility to life to understand what our instinct is telling us and readjust our behavior. And our unconscious then is always going to keep giving you the best answer it can all the time, 7 by 24 by 365. And, sometimes I get a dream and I say, well, tell me something I don't know. Okay. Because the dream is trying to tell me something that I already knew. and, but sometimes it's whacking me up at the side of the head and it's saying, this isn't right. And so, um, there was a time when I was unemployed, um, in my middle age, in my midlife crisis, and my unconscious is giving me all these execution dreams. I was being executed by hanging, by guillotine, by firing squad, you name it. My unconscious was giving me these dreams. And in a way, it was telling me, I could have said to it, well, tell me something I don't know. I mean, obviously, I knew that I had to get a job and I had to change this situation, and I was having trouble doing that. And so I knew that. But my unconscious keeps saying, get a job. This isn't right. This isn't you. And that's what the message was at that time. Okay, let's see. So anyway, you're going to be dragged along and you're going to call it fate. And the point is, we might have reached the goal walking upright. In other words, we could have changed the situation and stayed upright if only we had paid attention to the hints. And example is the last thing I did in the U.S. Marine Corps was I got out of my car on a very cold day, but after a thaw, and the parking lot was covered with ice, and I wasn't conscious of it. And then the sun came out, and it melted this ice a little bit so that there was this extremely slippery surface of ice across this parking lot at Marine Corps Base Quantico. So I jump out of my car, I have my mind somewhere else, and boom, I fell down and I broke my leg, and I was laid up for 6 weeks, and that ended my Marine Corps career. And so probably I should have known at that time, before that, the Marine Corps isn't really what your goal in life should be. You need to be doing something else. And so my unconscious was trying to get through to me, and it just let me have this accident. Whereas if I'd been very conscious and paying attention at that time, I might have gotten across that parking lot safely, but I didn't. I had my mind on something else. Bang, your leg is broken. And now a year ago, I had to have a new ankle because of it after 28 years. So now I have an ankle replacement because of it. And so I got dragged along by fate because I hadn't noticed the hints before then. So anyway, okay, so that's that section. Let me look at your comments, and then I will come back and finish this paragraph. So Miles says, Skip has told each of us something. Now you, reading this, has something we need to know from you. BTS Army, okay, I'm tweeting. Kislev, thank you so much. Daniela sends a purple heart, which I appreciate. Peter, a lot of the structural elements of Our Lady were made of stone and remain. Yes, they do. And it still remains to be seen whether they can be saved. I think there may be structural issues yet, but we'll see. I'm hopeful. Miles says, your mother, 1, met your father and now becomes 2, and they gave birth to a child as 3, and the child brings the family 4, which is back to the 1. Each is also a consciousness raising. we are closer to the truth. Sean says, I have an analysis on the immolation of the cathedral. Faith is the acknowledgement of union. The burning goddess of reason has lost her head. The light of faith can resurrect. Faith's inevitable promise contains enantiodromia, which is quite true, Sean, metaphorically at least. And the seeds of hell will bloom from the earth as dandelions, as promised by the goddess of a different time. The ancient willingness provided her star, and she has not abandoned it yet. And so anyway, this is a reference in part to the goddess of reason, that at one time the Cathedral of Notre Dame was desecrated during the French Revolution, and they crowned the goddess of reason in the cathedral. After covering all the Christian icons, they built up a mountain inside the cathedral, and on the top of that mountain they created a false set of pillars like ancient Greece. And then an opera star of the time was selected to be the goddess of reason, and she was given a throne and was crowned as the goddess of reason by the Republicans of the French Revolution. And that actually became a national religion in France for a short period of time. It was banned by Napoleon, I think, at that time. Jerome said, we each need to become aware of our particular motivational differences in instinctual drives as compared to others. Jung shows that fulfillment rewards are based upon different modes of receiving and processing information. That's certainly true. But I'm still trying to get through this one paragraph in answer to Job, and I'm trying to do it in a way that is understandable to everyone. And then once you're hooked by Carl Jung, then you're for the rest of your life circumambulating the center, trying to get, and what happens is you spiral deeper and deeper into your own unconscious and understand yourself better and better. Okay, so the next paragraph, the only thing that really matters now, so that was the end of a basic idea in that paragraph, but then he says the only thing that really matters now is whether man can climb up to a higher moral level, to a higher plane of consciousness, in order to be equal to the superhuman powers which the fallen angels have played into his hands. And so here there are a lot of references. What he's referring to is whether man can climb up to a higher moral level. So that means a level where all of us understand that we have both moral and immoral streams being presented from the unconscious into our conscious mind. And we have to test the spirits. And this comes also from the Bible, 1 John 4:1, where Jesus is reported to have said, you have to test the spirits. And we all have to recognize that we have evil spirits coming forth as well as good spirits coming forth in our psyche. And so the higher moral level would be understanding that, being conscious of that, realizing that we're not just good little boys and girls. We're not. We all have evil within us. And one of the things that Jungian psychologists say is that when you begin an analysis, the first thing that you confront is manifest evil. And the reason is that most people are not conscious of the fact that they have evil within them. They think it's, oh, it's that person over there. They never admit that it's within you. It's within you, it's within me, it's within every human being. And so a part of the process of individuation is to recognize that you have both good and evil streams coming from your unconscious, and your ego needs to be strong enough to choose the right path. And what we see in civilization, everything that you can see in your room, everything that you can see in your society is based on human beings selecting the good. Okay, it doesn't mean that evil doesn't present itself. It starts to in many places. So we see that in authoritarian governments, for example, or people who want to be authoritarian. And they always are manifesting the wrong path. But as Mohandas Gandhi said, there have been tyrants, and for a time they can seem very strong, but in the end, they always fail. Think of it, always. And that's why, because the human consciousness is always the morality that's natural and innate in the human consciousness is normally selecting from the good stream. And that's the result of the result is civilization. Everything that you can see comes from the good side. I mean, every product, let's say, because if it doesn't succeed and it fails. And so when evil starts to manifest itself, we pretty much know what's evil and what isn't, and we can get it out of the system. It sometimes takes a long time. As Gandhi said, there have been tyrants, and for a time they can seem very powerful, but in the end, they always fail. Think of it, always. And this is why, because our egos are strong enough to decide what's right and what's wrong, and what belongs in civilization and what doesn't belong in civilization. And so anyway, so it means a higher moral level. So it means, first of all, that we no longer rely on cause and effect or the law as presented by the Ten Commandments, but we can decide for ourselves. And Esther Harding, in this book, Psychic Energy, Its Sources and Its Transformation, talks about the levels in Buddhism and the levels of consciousness that are represented in Buddhism. And so I want to just read this to you because it'll help you. And so the first level is the man of little intellect. The second level is the man of ordinary intellect. And the third is the man of superior intellect. So this is just one page. It is interesting to observe that the Buddhists of all of the Mahayana sect also distinguish 3 stages of human consciousness, which correspond to a surprising degree to the stages we have differentiated here. The naive stage, ruled over by the autos, in which the individual is completely dominated by his bodily needs and desires, marks the man of little intellect. The consciousness of such a man is exceedingly narrow, being bounded by the limits of his own biological desirousness. For him, the Buddhists say, the best thing is to have faith in the law of cause and effect. He is admonished to observe the outcome of his preoccupation with his autoerotic desires. And so this is cause and effect, and this is karma. what goes around comes around. And, if you did something bad, you're going to get hit back. You're going to end up in prison or something like that. So that's the man of little intellect. Next paragraph. The man in the ego stage of development is called by the Buddhists the man of ordinary intellect. His attention is wholly directed to controlling his environment for his personal satisfaction and advantage. He has gained some control over his instinctive drives, and for him the ego is now king. He classifies everything in terms of its own wishes, taking the good and rejecting the evil, not realizing that what he discards falls into the unconscious and does not cease to exist. In this stage, the Buddhists say, the best thing is to recognize both within and without oneself the workings of the law of opposites. So that's the law I've been talking about, where you keep swinging back from one side to the other. And so as long as in the United States, as long as we keep in our cable news channels emphasizing red state, blue state, enemy, and it's like a football game, and it bounces back and forth, and one time one wins, one time the other wins, and we keep putting things that we think will favor our side into the equation on the red side or the blue side. As long as we're there, we're just people of ordinary intellect, and we're bouncing back and forth between the opposites. And that's why you see the opposite party often winning in presidential elections. Okay, third, the state of the individual whom the Buddhists call the man of superior intellect corresponds to the third stage of our psychological classification. In him, the identification of the ego with the supreme value has been dissolved. In consequence, he experiences the inner dynamic factor as something other than the conscious ego, though definitely within the psyche. For his state, according to the Buddhists, the best thing is to have a thorough comprehension of the inseparableness of the knower, the object of knowledge, and the act of knowing. Okay, so this is what Dr. Jung is referring to in these levels, a higher moral level. We need to understand that all things are connected, as as Michio Kaku, the famous physicist who's on television in the United States, once said, every atom in the universe is connected to every other atom in the universe. Everything is connected. And so we need to bring our conscious mind up to the point where we understand that. And if we do something here, it's going to have an effect over there. And it may not be an effect we're very happy with. Okay. And so when he says, remember, I've been emphasizing this Job archetype, the archetype of contest, defeat, lamentation, and rebirth. We can see that happening in the Notre Dame issue right now, because Notre Dame in effect was out there as a manifestation of the Catholic Church, let's say, or the manifestation of a pinnacle of humanity. And last night when it burned, we were all defeated because that pinnacle of humanity was now crushed. Now we have to all lament about that, and many of us will be terribly crushed by it. And you saw last night, go back and look at the link if you haven't seen it at the top of this chat, you'll find how I reacted to it, which was, I was definitely feeling defeated, and I was lamenting. But then I know that there will be a rebirth, and we all know that there will be a rebirth. And so the more times you go through that cycle in your life. This is the message of the book of Job in the Bible. The more times you go through that cycle, the stronger your ego will become. And it takes a strong ego to be able to select from the two streams, to select the good side as opposed to the evil side. And so this is what Dr. Jung is talking about, this higher plane of consciousness that we all need to reach in order to be equal to the superhuman powers which the fallen angels have played into his hands. So what Dr. Jung is saying here is that, okay, we have logic, and we have the logos and the scientific method, and that's all well and good. The scientific method gave everything that you can see in my video here, and it gave us discernment so we can build things. And obviously we need the logos. So to build my coffee cup, we had to have someone who paid 100% attention to the details of that coffee cup. And the same is true of your automobile, your computer, your iPhone, whatever it is. It has to be 100% right. If it's wrong in the slightest little degree and it therefore doesn't function, then there's a problem. And so we need logos in society. We definitely do. And when you're building products, you need it 100%. But we can't lock down our whole lives based on the logos, because there is another element in life which is irrational. It's not rational, it's irrational. It comes from creativity. So we would get no new things if we couldn't evolve and discern that, okay, this is beautiful. My iPhone is beautiful today, but tomorrow it's going to be better because someone with creative instinct, which comes from the irrational side of life, will have invented something new that makes my iPhone better. And so that's why we need the irrational too. And that's why we've all been mistaken when we have allowed our education system to write the art class and the music class out of our public education, because we need people to develop their creativity so that we can get better and better things. If we don't do that, then what's going to happen is we're all going to be robots. And, obviously there's some people in every society that think that would be great. Let's just make all these people over here robots, and then we can live a wonderful life and they'll just support us because they're the robots. But it doesn't work that way. Life doesn't work that way. And ultimately, human beings are going to resist and revolt against being forced to be robots, no matter where they are. And, history is replete with these facts. and the problem is that our scientific method, our logic, has created nuclear weapons and chemical weapons, but we haven't raised ourselves yet, although that's arguable with these weapons. But we've created weapons that can destroy all life on the planet. And so we have to have human beings who have raised themselves up to this higher moral level, who know that if you use this weapon, it is going to destroy life on Earth. And so they are able, because of their higher level of consciousness and what they have to do with their egos to get to that higher level of consciousness. We do have people in power in all nuclear countries who know that the use of a nuclear weapon is going to be the beginning of the end. And even Kim Jong-un knows that. He knows that if he detonates even one nuclear weapon in a populated area, that will be the end of his regime instantly. Um, and um, and so he, above all, should know that. Okay, so he has to be at a higher moral level where he knows he's got this weapon, but he can't use it, because if he uses it, he's done. Um, and that's a higher level of consciousness. And so we need people with this higher level of consciousness to be equal to those superhuman powers that the logos and the scientific method has given us. That's Dr. Jung's point. And so then he goes on, but we can make no progress with himself unless he becomes very much acquainted with his own nature. And so I think all of us who are involved in this conversation right now certainly know that our nature is probably not up to this higher level that's needed, and we need to figure out what we need to know in order to get there. And as Dr. Jung then observes, unfortunately, a terrifying ignorance prevails in this respect, and an equally great aversion to increasing the knowledge of his intrinsic character. And so society in general has treated mental health as a taboo, and so it hasn't been able to be talked about. And so that's the brilliance of what this BTS group has brought to us, because it has understood the importance of mental health and has emphasized mental health throughout its discography, not only in the latest album, Map of the Soul Persona, but in its other music. And so that's a tribute to not only them, but also the 80 million fans around the world who recognize the importance of starting to talk about mental health, because only if we talk about mental health can we raise humanity to this higher level. And as you said, it's a terrifying ignorance. And we all have this terrifying ignorance. And so now it's incumbent upon all of us to try to talk about mental health as a very, very important factor for the future of our species. Okay, it's not just something that you can argue out of the system. If the human species can't keep control of these powers that we've created for ourselves, then we're going to destroy ourselves. So So then he says, however, in the most unexpected quarters nowadays, we find people who can no longer blink the fact that something ought to be done with man in regard to his psychology. So we can include BTS in that. And when he says no longer blink the fact, it means can no longer ignore the fact that something needs to be done about human psychology, and we need to help human psychology evolve to the next level. And that's what BTS has done throughout their discography. Regardless of what you think about these young men, regardless of what you think about their hair, their jewelry, or the color of their clothing, to their great credit, they have brought forth this issue of mental health, which is a taboo that we have failed to discuss properly in society. And that has to change. And that's Dr. Jung's point in 1951 when he wrote this book, Answer to Job. This book, I've been reading from this book, Answer to Job by C.G. Jung, and I'm in paragraph 746. And this is his point, that we have to make people more aware of their own psychology. And then he says, unfortunately, the little word ought tells us that they do not know what to do and do not know the way that leads to the goal. And so now we see, or now I have seen, And maybe you will start to see that we haven't known what to do up until now. I honestly had no idea how I could spread the necessity of educating society about psychology around the world. I had no idea. And I imagined, as Dr. Jung did, he said it was going to take 600 years to get that idea out into the public. And mind you, he was living at a time before we knew much about computers at all, and before there was broad communication across the world. And so he didn't know what to do, but he knew that it had to come from somewhere. And so when I saw what the BTS group is doing, and it's talking about this taboo of mental health, and they have 80 million followers around the world as of last week. As of this week, it might be considerably higher because these things will pass through the system. As we saw on Saturday Night Live, when Emma Stone simply mentioned their name and the girls in the audience screamed, that's a primal scream that came up at the time of Elvis Presley and the Beatles and the Rolling Stones 50 years ago. And so many young women who never heard about BTS last week are now going to be drawn up into that. And if the young women are drawn into that, then the men will follow. They will say, geez, I don't understand this. I can't understand why people like this group. But it doesn't matter if they understand, because the young women are going there and the men will follow the women. And so I've already had people comment that definitely they've seen men starting to dress more like BTS and having colored hair and that sort of thing. And, that's indicia of these things that are happening unconsciously. And so what I know, because of all my work, is that all of my work has been preparing for this. So now I can speak to members of the BTS Army, BTS Armies, which stands for Adorable Representatives and Moderators for Youth. Okay, that's what Army stands for the BTS Army. And so the BTS Armies are going to represent BTS around the world, and they're going to be speaking for mental health because they're going to learn about it from all of the BTS albums that are out there. And as that happens, it's unstoppable, fortunately. And so, but, Dr. Jung, when he wrote this, unfortunately, that little word ought tells us that they do not know what to do and do not know the way that leads to the goal. And the goal being teaching us more about our own psychology. This is the way. This is the way. And so we are going to see more and more bands that do have an influence on youth who are going to start doing other albums on other people's literature. And it's going to be a way to teach young people that is par excellence, because they will teach themselves. And they don't need their parents saying, oh, don't watch those guys, they're gay, or something like that. Well, I don't know if they're gay. I'm very doubtful that they're gay, except maybe one of them. But what I do know is that they're changing the world, and that is unstoppable, and it's going to keep going. And so he says, we can, of course, hope for the undeserved grace of God, who hears our prayers. And we've had that with the advent of this group, I think. But that's the undeserved grace of God, because none of us would have predicted it. But God, who also does not hear our prayers, wants to become man, and for that purpose, he has chosen through the Holy Ghost the creaturely man filled with darkness, the natural man who is tainted with original sin and who learnt the divine arts and sciences from the fallen angels. So his point is that all of us have an element of the divine within us, and it is up to us in our consciousness to decide what civilization should be and not be. And then he says, the guilty man is eminently suitable and is therefore chosen to become the vessel for the continuing incarnation, not the guiltless one who holds himself aloof from the world and refuses to pay tribute to life, for in him the dark God would find no room. And so by this, he's referring to nihilists who are sitting on their mother's sofa, eating popcorn and listening to music, but they say, I don't want to do anything. Well, you need to go get a life if you're a nihilist. And if you start to get a life, and then you know what to do, because the two streams are easily selected when you're trying to do something. And then you will get a life, and you will put meaning in your life, because by getting a life, you put meaning in your life. And so, but if you're going to sit on your sofa, then you're not going to make any mistakes. Great, but you're also not going to have a life. You're not paying your tribute to life. And so it's only those who go out and make mistakes and are willing to make mistakes and actually try things, those are the people that are going to make a difference in life. Okay, so that's the end of that paragraph. I'll go back and look at your comments, and I'll try to finish up this last paragraph here. And so let's see. So Grenade says, some people go as far as to say the ego itself is bad. And of course, that has been the error. And, even Buddhism makes that error, because Buddhism refers to ego as self, and it wants to wipe away ego. And that's not Dr. Jung's perspective at all. Dr. Jung believes that from a psychological point of view, we must build up our ego, which is the conscious mind. But it's necessary to understand his definition of ego, which is different from the definition of ego as prideful or arrogant. Okay, so we have this idea that egotistical people are arrogant. Well, that's true. Okay, but he's not talking about ego in that way, not ego as arrogance. He's talking about ego as the conscious center of your psyche, and self as the unconscious center of your psyche. And it's the unconscious that's in charge, not the ego. But so when you hear people saying ego is bad, typically what they're saying is that arrogance is bad. Okay. And I've got strengths. So some people say that love to yourself brings people equals being egoistic, not caring about other people. I think they misunderstand. Definitely that's true. And so first of all, we have to respect ourselves and respect that we were pretty much made more or less in the same way, and that all of us have within us something that we can bring forth, but that is typically in the unconscious. Bernard says it's funny, though, because with those people, it's the ego thinking the ego is bad. Yes, a very good point. Sean says, laugh out loud. Those kinds of people are best at bringing everyone's shadow out. And yes, they do. They bring out the human shadow. And the human shadow is the dark side of the unconscious. And so if you think of the movie Star Wars, where they're talking about the Force is the good, but there is a dark side, and the dark side is Darth Vader, and the Empire. And so we have to all go back and reevaluate the whole Star Wars series based on understanding Jungian psychology. He says, I remember Marie-Louise von France talking about the shadow as a room with a bunch of doors. We often leave some doors open. Yes, we do. Centerbush, that's interesting, Sean, because in Fake Love, there are rooms for each of the BTS members. They are using a psychological technique called magic shop to trade the items representing their fake love. That's a very interesting metaphor. Grenade says, I'd say I struggle with it every day. We all struggle with it every day, Grenade, so it's not unusual. And we struggle to love ourselves and then use ourselves to go out and get the life that we were meant to get. And that's not going to be the same with everyone. It's not going to be the same with anyone, but we have to go live our lives. And Miles says, William Perry, former Secretary of Defense, George Shultz, Sam Nunn, all call for strategic re-engagement with Russia to prevent catastrophe. And, obviously that has happened in certain ways. And obviously, to his credit, Ronald Reagan did cause that readjustment. And others before him also contributed to that. And, even going back to Eisenhower, people were trying to communicate with the Russians because they knew the communication was absolutely necessary. And so they had the hotline and the red phone in the White House and the Kremlin because they knew they had to keep communication or they were going to destroy the world. And they were right. Centerbush says, J. Hope keeps trying to keep his door shut, but the fear of his abandonment keeps slipping through. Interesting. I have to go back and look at that music video. Sean says, I believe it was Emily Dickinson that said, one need not be a chamber to be haunted. One need not be a house. The brain has corridors surpassing material place. And that's definitely true. That's what we're talking about here. And Senator Bush likes that quote, and I do too. We have to have better emoticons on YouTube because these are terrible. And I've got strengths as people are often distracted from talking about mental health. I feel like people in my country are more concerned with other more pressing problems. And, what I would say is there's really no more pressing problem than this because it's the mother and father of all of our problems. But we need to raise consciousness about that so that we can start to address it. And the species can address it. There's no doubt in my mind that that's possible. But first, we have to admit it's a problem. And Grenade says, in America, mental health has become a multi-billion-dollar industry. Yes, it has. but primarily its solution relates to use of drugs, and that killed 72,000 people in the United States last year. And so that's 14,000 more people in 1 year than we killed in the whole Vietnam War. And so we need to get a grip on this drug epidemic. And part of it relates to the pharmaceuticals industry and the fact that they pay doctors to go stick stuff in people. And the result is it creates this black economy that's really awful and has really destroyed a large part of the fabric of the United States. And now I personally know, or in my immediate relationship, 3 people who've died from this drug epidemic. And it's totally horrible, and we probably all know someone. And so we need to fight back that billion-dollar industry very definitely, and we need to get through to our legislators that they have to fix it, and it can't be allowed to continue. And they have to take the responsibility to fix it. They have to have a strong enough ego to take the position that it has to be fixed. And Andrew says, you've helped change my life and make the connection between religion, science, and psychology. Thank you. Thank you, Andrew. I'm glad I've done that. We have to understand what these things are about. And Senator Bush, Suga, as August D., his rep persona, talks about the social anxiety and depression. He wanted to help others. Sean, a lot of people help people through a disingenuous process to gain brownie points rather than caring about others, definitely. And Miles says he was seconding Andrew's statement. Senator Bush, American pharmaceutical companies want to keep feeding us pills, big business, absolutely. Andrew, this cultural shift that you're speaking of in regard to males, females, and gender expression started back in the mid-2000s. Well, it started long before that, because when the Beatles came and Elvis Presley came and started wiggling his hips, and the Beatles came with longer hair. When we look at it now, it seems quite tame, but back then it was shocking to our parents who were born in the Victorian era. And so the cultural shift has been going on for decades and decades, long before 2000. Grace says, wisdom comes to those without intention. Yes. Andrew, initiated through the advent of social media, new ways of connecting socially across distance in a short period of time, it's now being expressed on a grand scale, very definitely. And I actually, last night in the session that I left the link for in the chat, I read my essay near the beginning of that video. I read my essay called Culture Pot Full of Holes, which is talking about the fact that social media and the internet has now put holes in everybody's culture. And so now something new has to be regenerated. And that's a job for all of humanity. Just a few short years after its initial instantiation, which is not surprising given the exponential increase in technological advancement. And so we have to talk about the power that's been given to us by the fallen angels, as Dr. Jung referred to them. But that's where the scientific method has increased our ability to do things, and yet our psyche hasn't been able to keep up. And so our psyche needs to start breathlessly running on behind and trying to catch up to what we've introduced into our world. Um, and Andrew says, thank you for responding. It's wonderful to hear from someone else. Sean, oops, meant to fix one part. Let's see. So I've got strength says Russia has many different regions, and in one region, they refuse to allow BTS movie theaters because it's gay propaganda. It's just a concert. There's nothing gay. Too bad for armies there. Well, there are parts of the world that have been cut off. And, until very recently, there were no movie theaters whatsoever in Saudi Arabia. And I think there are still not places where you can listen out loud to music. Certainly, there are Saudis who, through satellite, are able to listen to music, but you can't do so publicly. And so, but these things anyway seep in no matter what. So these changes are seeping through American culture, or not American culture, but the culture of humanity, and they will get everywhere, even though some governments are trying to hold, they're trying to hold on, but it's like the Great Wall of China. Just ask Genghis Khan whether the Great Wall of China kept out the Mongols. It certainly didn't. Centerbush, just because they express themselves differently from traditional masculinity doesn't mean they are gay. Each of them have expressed what their ideal girl is like through various interviews. And I look forward to reading or hearing those interviews. I just have not had the time, but I'm certainly going to pay attention to it because of how important I think this development is. Miles says, I've got strength. Yes, wherever authorities try to prevent free and nonviolent speech, there is a big evil. Senator Bush, it's just Russia has certain ideas of what being male is. Well, yeah, and, all of us do. And, I'm not saying that I'm going to go out and buy a pink shirt. I have owned a pink shirt in my past, but I'm certainly going to look for more purple shirts. I have a couple, and I'm going to look for other purple shirts. But, so I don't think I'm going to change my persona that much, but, it will change society and culture over time. And it won't only be BTS. I mean, BTS, to their credit, is the breakthrough group, it seems to me. But saying, oh, yeah, I should do that, that could be very good. And so I wouldn't be surprised to see many groups and rappers and so on starting to get on this bandwagon now. But, everybody's going to remember BTS the same as we remember the Beatles and the Stones and Elvis Presley. And so everyone else will be running along behind. Remember what Rudyard Kipling said in one of his poems. They copied all they could follow, but they couldn't copy my mind. I left them sweating and stealing, a year and a half behind. And so that's very prophetic and exactly how BTS should regard that, because they're innovating and everybody else is sweating and stealing behind. And so Grace says there are depressed people who are extremely egocentric as well as arrogant, two sides of the same coin. Um, I I don't know how to respond exactly to that, Gray. I have to think about what your statement is. I'm not saying it's wrong. It doesn't compute just now. Centerbush says, if you watch the videos for I Need You and Run and then watch Fake Love, it may make more sense. Absolutely. Thank you. I will certainly do my best to go back and see all these videos, but I'm way behind on that, and I am going to bring it forward because of what I see as the importance of what they're doing. Miles, that's an important insight, Gray. I've got strength. I'm not sure if Suga was thinking about helping others with his songs about depression back then. He is certainly thinking so now after he saw the response from people, but back then he could just express his thoughts, his feelings, because he had the need to do so. And yes, that's normal for songwriters. I mean, there are plenty of country western songs that are filled with depression of the songwriter about something that's happened. I've lost my love or whatever it is. And so that's quite normal. But to have and those songs are very popular because people do have depression, and it can be ameliorated by understanding that other people go through the same situation, that you're not alone, that your experience is like other people experience. And that's actually kind of the first step of psychotherapy, as I understand it, from Ann Belford Ulanoff, who has written, and I've talked about this in the past. I'm not going to get into it in depth now, but certainly knowing that other people struggle with the same mental health issues that you struggle with is a way to help you work through those things and to integrate those things so you can go on with your life. And so I think it's great now that Suga has recognized that it's not only him and him just writing a song for him about his depression, but that if he does that and communicates with his fan group, then he can help change their lives too. That's a tremendous leap and a very important leap for everyone. So, you know, we'll hear more and more even country western songs trying to do that, I'm sure. Watch for it on The Voice. Centerbush, if you watch any videos explaining the BTS fictional storyline, it will be eye-opening. A YouTuber by the name of X Celeste breaks the timeline down really well. And I have read a couple of discretions of these timelines. One that was done here by Cynthia Perez is particularly noteworthy. And what I think that storyline means, I mean, everybody is interacting and interacting with that storyline and being attracted by it. And the reason is that that storyline is archetypal. It's the same experience of all of us in some way or another. And so when you hit on something archetypal, when you're doing something creative, then you're going to be much more successful than if you're trying to be a camera, if you're a painter. If you're a painter, okay, if you can do trompe-l'oeil, which is a kind of painting, and what trompe-l'oeil means to fool the eye. So if you can make your painting so real that it's perfect and it's even realer than real, okay, that's a style of painting, but most of us don't do that, and that's a very specific style of painting. But beyond that, trying to be a camera when we have cameras for that is not the right way to go, in creativity. The way to go with creativity is to try to bring something forth from yourself, from your unconscious, that will communicate with everybody in the world. And what BTS has done is they've obviously brought something forth from their own unconscious, and it is communicating at a very deep level with millions of fans around the world, which I would guess it's probably 160 million today. But the certified number that I know of is 80 million fans around the world. And so when you connect like that, it means you've connected with something that's archetypal, and it's in the deep unconscious of every human being. And if you do that, you're going to be a very successful artist, whatever your art. Okay. Center Bush. Okay, I've got strengths. When I was writing about depression, I certainly did so just to express myself. Sugar is pronounced like sugar. Sugar. Okay, sugar was without an R. Okay. So sugar. And Center Bush. I hope Dr. Jung would be proud of BTS. I think they represent his works well. And I think so too. And I think he would be surprised, of course, but he would be surprised of many of the developments in the world since he died. Okay, he died in 1961, so probably he wasn't even very aware of computers at that time. We barely knew of the UNIVAC in 1961, and you know, who would have thought that you would be using a computer for your telephone today in 1961? I don't think anybody had that concept in mind at that time. But if you took 5 or 10 minutes to talk him through what the developments have been since he died, I have no doubt that he would be thrilled by what's happening. And as he said in this passage that I read, nobody knows what to do. And so now we know something about what to do. I've got strength says he wanted to become successful, but now as he became very successful, he needs a more substantial purpose of helping people. Yeah. Dariana says Suga actually just produced a song for another group, Epic High, talking about mental health issues. So that's interesting. And of course, when the Beatles broke up, they started to produce their own songs, and those have been very powerful. Obviously, John Lennon's songs were very powerful after he left the Beatles. So I think they can ride their high for now as a group, but they can also make their own marks. And I think of Simon and Garfunkel as an example. Every so often, Art Garfunkel and Paul Simon get together and they'll do a concert together of the old songs they did together 40 years ago. But Paul Simon has definitely gone on and been a unique songwriter in his own right, different from Art Garfunkel. And Art Garfunkel went on and did his own thing as well. So, you know, I'm not saying that BTS has to stay together in order to achieve this. I think now that we've had this aha moment about what they're doing and what can be done with it, I think that there's going to be a lot of new development out of that, and it's going to be very, very powerful. So Senator Bush says, but now Dr. Jung's spirit is in the world even more so than before. He is still with us and helping us, very definitely. And he knew that. He knew that he was going to be posthumous, as he said. And, you know, so he died a very satisfied man. He knew that he had fulfilled the role that he could perform in a lifetime. And he said the things that he realized in the 19 teens took him a lifetime to expose, and it was really the job of more than one lifetime. And so he left us those collected works, and now we have them. And so now they are going to be spread much more around the world. They've been held in a very tight circle up till now, and that is changing. I've got Strength says, yes, Epic High's album is very good too. Other songs are also deep, Skip. They are older than BTS, and they were Suga's inspiration. That's interesting. Okay, I'll look for that. I just haven't had a chance to get to it yet because so many things are happening, and I never expected a month ago that I'd be willing and able to do a 2-hour session every day. I started with 1 a week and then 2 a week, and now it's every day. So it's quite a different thing. Miles says, I actually listen to my favorite 80s songs with more depth now, having learned from Skip. And Daniela, make me thinking what King artist will emerge after BTS influence being inspiration for the next generation, seeing what Epic High did to Suga. Okay, I don't know anything about that. Center Bush, that is so cool, Miles. That is an interesting idea. Okay, now I want to try to get through this last paragraph, so I will do that. It's paragraph 747. Okay, and so Dr. Jung says, since the apocalypse, and by the apocalypse he means World War II and the use of the nuclear weapons during World War II, since the apocalypse we now know again that God is not only to be loved, but also to be feared. And, we can talk about religion and God again at some point. Just for the record, and this applies to Notre Dame also, so let me read Dr. Jung's definition of God, which he gave in December, or it was published in December of 61 after his death. And believe it or not, in Good Housekeeping magazine, but it was based on an interview with Dr. Jung. And so this appears in Encounter with the Self by Edward Edinger, which is his portable analytic hour. And I've read this entire book into the YouTube channel, and you can find it on the homepage of this channel. But here, he provides Dr. Jung's definition of God. God is the name by which I designate all things which cross my willful path violently and recklessly, all things which upset my subjective views, plans, and intentions, and change the course of my life for better or worse. And so if we apply that to Notre Dame last night, if it was an act of God, which it seems to have been, then it is one of those things which crossed all of our willful paths violently and recklessly and upset our views about the world, our plans and intentions. Maybe we wanted to visit Notre Dame someday and change the course of our life for better or for worse. Obviously, many people have had their lives changed, as this picture is proof. And so for better or for worse, they're having their lives changed. And so God is to be loved, but also to be feared. He fills us with evil as well as with good. Otherwise, he would not need to be feared. And because he wants to become man, the uniting of his antinomy, his opposites, must take place in man. That means we need to recognize that each one of us has within us evil. We have to integrate that fact and see how that changes the way we think about morality. This involves man in a new responsibility, and that's what I was just saying. We have a new responsibility. He can no longer wriggle out of it on the plea of his littleness or nothingness. Obviously not, because someone who's very small, who most Americans wouldn't even think about, or a popular group from Korea changing American culture. Oh my God, who would think of that? And yet they're the ones that are doing it. And, me creating 900 videos about C.G. Jung, okay, I've been bumping along, but this is changing that vastly. And he says, for the dark god has slipped the atom bomb and chemical weapons into his hands and given him the power to empty out the apocalyptic vials of wrath on his fellow creatures. So the scientific method has given us the power to destroy all life on Earth. So it's our responsibility to develop our consciousness and our morality to the level that we can handle that fact. And that isn't going to be done by the 10 Commandments any longer. Okay, because obviously, if you follow the 10 Commandments explicitly and literally, thou shalt not kill, as an example, then you can't go to the grocery store anymore, because everything at the grocery store, everything that you eat, was at one time alive and has been killed for your benefit. And so we have to understand what the 10 Commandments mean. We have to understand what we as moral individuals must be. And so since he has been granted an almost godlike power, he can no longer remain blind and unconscious. So remember, there's a difference between awareness and consciousness. All creatures have some sort of awareness. Even trees will turn their leaves toward the sun, and that's a kind of awareness. But consciousness is understanding that each of us is alive and that we will die, and that we have a certain time on Earth during which we can make a difference or not. And it's our responsibility to make our little tile in the great mosaic of life for one reason or another. And if we do that, then our life has meaning. And if we don't do that, so sorry. He must know something of God's nature and of metaphysical processes if he is to understand himself and therefore achieve gnosis of the divine. And so understanding metaphysical processes, everything that we've been talking about today is metaphysical. Everything in psychology is metaphysical. Okay, the scientists who talk about brain scans and figuring out what part of the brain something is happening in when someone is dreaming, that's nothing. Okay, that doesn't say anything about the universe of the psyche of that individual. Okay, it says that something's happening there. Yeah, okay, so what? But the point is that until science can tell you something about what's happening in your psyche and the universe of you, then we're nowhere, and we're really nowhere. And he knew that even to the day he died, that we just don't know enough yet. And so there's room for thousands of PhD theses on these topics. But first, we need to get Jungian psychology into universities so people can earn PhDs for that. And so far as I know, Pacifica Graduate Institute and Saybrook are the only ones that do offer that, other than C.G. Jung Institutes. And normally you can't even get into a C.G. Jung Institute until you already have a PhD or a professional degree, a Master of Social Work or Master of Family master of family therapy, I think it is. And so we need to understand metaphysical processes, which means what's happening in the psyche and what we're talking about when we're talking about God. And we have to understand ourselves in order to achieve gnosis. So this goes back to Dr. Jung being asked, do you believe in God? And his response is, I have no need to believe. I know. And I had my epiphany at that moment, because I said to myself, I too know. But then I had to spend the next 10 years studying Dr. Jung's work to understand what it is that he and I knew. Unconsciously, I knew that he had something, but I didn't know what. And I'm starting to get it now. All right, so going back, we need to end very soon, because last night YouTube cut off the beginning of the video, so I don't want that to happen. And so I've got Strength Epic Highs album. It's very good. 2 other songs are also deep. Skip that. They are older than BTS, and they were Suga's inspiration, so we'll look back at that. I don't know that group. Miles, I actually listened to my favorite 80s songs. Okay, we did that. And so let's see if there's. And so Dariana says, in case you are interested, DK TV just uploaded a video explaining the new music video of BTS Boy with Love. That would be interesting. Danny Kim did a great job of persona. So I look forward to seeing that. Macho Man with reaction channels often reacts positive to BTS and becomes their biggest fans, and you notice they emulate the BTS easygoing way. They touch more often. Have men longed for a change? I think men have longed for a change, and all of a sudden they see that, because you know, there are these funny videos of guys being presented with BTS for the first time, as I've said last night and yesterday, and they're sort of stunned, but they're also attracted to it. And one of them said, there's nothing going on in his left brain, in his logical mind. It's empty, because everything that they're communicating is on the irrational side. It's on the right brain. And that was a very poignant comment that was very much true. And I think men have been longing for a change. Miles says, a little tile of a few millimeters can knock over another tile 1.5 times bigger. After 29 such bigger tiles, a tile the size of the Empire State Building will be knocked over. Yeah, let's be careful. Kislev says, sir, what you think about Jung and the astrology, that's going to have to go for another day. And I actually have talked about that quite extensively throughout my videos, of which there are 900. So please go back and look through the YouTube channel. I've indexed it as well as I could. I've got strengths as Miles. The same happened to me, not with 80s music, but with all music. I also began listening to a course about classical music from Yale University. It's really interesting and helps to understand music better. So, okay. We're 2 hours and 10 minutes into this session, so I'm going to have to stop. And I appreciate you being here today. And I hope you've felt it useful, and thank you for coming today. And this will be on playback shortly. Thank you for coming.